hit record. Again, you'll be getting both links from Tuesday night and tonight from Becca sometime tomorrow. That's my hope. I'm going to open up in a word of prayer, and then we'll go ahead and get after it because we have a ton to get through tonight. Lord, thank you for this time. And I ask, Lord, that tonight specifically would really, really encourage families as they think about funding college, either for themselves or for their precious little ones who are maybe not so little. May this time be edifying, encouraging, and hope-filled as they wrestle with ideas and concepts and challenge the typical path. May the end of this just be a gift and a blessing, which is our hope for all families at Birch. Thanks for this time in Jesus' name. Amen. Feel free, use the chat. If you got questions, please go ahead and put that in there. I'll do my best to get to them as we start working through some things. So by way of refresher, Tuesday night we talked about perspective and particularly on what we come to the table in terms of our approach. So some of the questions that I asked had to do with what you think about the importance of college, the role of the degree, the motivation for you specifically, looking at the today-tomorrow gap, figuring out what's the path, and do we will just walk blindly, steps forward, follow the herd. I didn't say that, but I'm saying it tonight. Or do we get creative? So tonight is a little bit more designed for the creative path. As I joked a little bit on Tuesday night, the path that I personally took was the scenic route, as I dubbed it. So for the typical person to finish a bachelor's, it's usually 4 to 5 years. I took 15. I don't necessarily recommend that, but that's the one that I took. And so along the way, much of what I'm going to be talking about, especially tonight, is what I personally did to get to the point after those couple of years where I had the student loans in 1998 to 1996 to 98, paid those off, and then the subsequent associates, masters, bachelors, and some other random stuff without debt. And so that's where I'm going to piece more of the story in tonight. And so it's not just stuff I've read in a book, but I have seen it, lived it, breathed it, and have helped others do the same. All right, so we're going to get after school-specific funding first. So I'd started top level. We were getting after what's the approach? What's the approach of this class? And as by way of reminder, this class is coming from, of course, a debt-free approach, but specifically on how do we approach college from a value creation standpoint. Yes, there'll be side effects of friendships, perhaps marriage, good memories, travel, cool projects, getting to know friends, yes. But from this class perspective, that is not the primary purpose, to pursue being trained, educated, literated in the avenues and practicalities to then go and create value in the marketplace. And for me, that's either being a stay-at-home parent or running a Fortune 500 company or anywhere in between or anything else. So from a values lens, let's continue. All right. When it comes to school specific, so if you have any idea what kind of school you want to go to, or specifically what school you're interested in, or multiple schools, focused first on their respective scholarships and grants. So if you want to start anywhere, start with this school, with the School of Scholarships and Grants program. So for those of you who are like 14 and just about to go into high school, this is a little tricky, but what I'm getting at is what's the roadmap from where you are to be able to get that specific schools to be able to qualify for those scholarships and grants. Difference here, grants are typically need-based, so based on your financial makeup and dynamics. Scholarships are typically merit-based. It's an important distinction to understand. So focus on the school. So let's say you want to go to U of O. I'm just using local examples. and you look at their scholarship options and you see what the requirements are. 3.5 GPA, I'm making this up, 1200 SAT, had to have 2 years of a foreign language, and you have to be able to like tie a knot behind your back. I don't know, whatever those are. So if you and or your student look at that and be like, okay, I've got 2 years to get to the point where I am ready to I meet those qualifications, so I'm a shoe-in for those scholarships and or grants. So that's why I encourage you to focus, because it's your competition pool is much smaller at the school level than it is at the national level, trying to compete for random scholarships through something like KPACs, which I'll talk about those later. All right, next thing to consider is this idea called bunching. And it's got nothing to do with like rolling up your sleeves or your pant legs being bunched or your socks being bunched down or any other clothing garment. But it's the idea where you have multiple kids or students, multiple students going to the same school at the same time. Another way to say it's like multiple student discount. So that's another thing to consider. If you've got kids that are stacked up pretty tight in terms of their age, and if you've got multiple kids at the same school, there is a likelihood that the school will give you more of a discount because of that. Do you know why would they do that? Well, they love legacy. They live, or triplets or quadruplets or however many lits you want to add to that. They live and die by their student population. One of the best ways to get their student population consistent and growing is to offer these kinds of benefits to encourage families staying with said school. Most of you are going to be familiar with this one, payment plan. I did this when I was finishing up my undergrad at Multnomah University here in Portland. We were about, after scholarships from the school and scholarships outside of the school, we were about $300 to $400 short a month. So grand total for the year, we were about $3,000 to $4,000 short. Well, we didn't have $3,000 to $4,000 to just cut them a check. So we paid the $50 a semester because that was the cost at that time. This was 2010. And set up a payment plan. It was a 10-month payment plan. So it started in August, ended in May. For about I think it was like $330 a month, I think it was. And at that time, that's when my wife and I joined Birch as participants. So as you know, being at Birch frees up some grocery money. Well, we repurposed that grocery money to pay for my undergrad, to cover the difference in the scholarships that I got, the grants that I got, and that difference to be able to help pay for that gap. So though you might be short several $1,000s, payment plan is a great way to spread the cost out and buy you time to come up with that difference. Yes, most colleges and universities offer payment plans for typically the school year. You could start earlier though. They typically start from August and go through May for a classic, September to May starting timeline. But you could start earlier. You just ask them, say, well, I know this is a 10-month, but could we start in July or even June? And could we just do 2 smaller payments to kind of get the ball rolling? And then you could work with the financial aid office. One other thing I didn't mention Tuesday night, because it just occurred to me because it was not in my notes. Once you fill out their FAFSA and you submit it and you get the application into the college, and then you get accepted and you get that award letter. And the award letter is, here's what we're going to offer you, the student and or parents, to come here. Now, because the FAFSA does a 2-year look back, meaning they look at 2 years previous taxes. What happens if your life today or when you apply looks very different than 2 years ago? So maybe you made a whole lot more 2 years ago than you did today, or something dramatic just happened that's not accounted for in the financial aid application. Then you can go back to the school and ask for a PJ. And a PJ is called a professional judgment. And that's where you go to the financial aid counselor. And if they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, just go straight above them, go to the financial aid assistant director or director. They know exactly what I'm saying, and ask for that. It's a small little application. It basically allows you to detail the changes in your situation. And then they will manually, or can manually, adjust your financial aid package in lieu of that new information. So asterisk that in your notes. It's called professional judgment. All right, let's talk about specific savings programs. Washington residents, here's a nice little, that Tina already jumped the gun on me. Thank you for that, Tina. In the chat, basically it's a 3-to-1 savings match. In short, it's a version of an IDA, or an individual development account. And for every dollar you put in, this program matches $3, but it's school specific. So there's only a certain amount of schools that this program works for. And there's typically a $3,000 cap. So if you put in $3,000, the program will match $9,000. So you can get upwards of $12,000 for the entirety of the program, not per year, but for the entirety of the program. Oregon residents, I didn't leave you out. Yours is called E3 Savings. Same concept, same restrictions in terms of school. And both of these are need-based. So if you're making, if your parents are making $160,000 a year, you're not going to qualify for this. If you're a family of 8 and your parents make 70 to 80, you might, because it takes in your family size as well. So it's definitely worth a consideration if you're planning to stay in Washington or Oregon, and then looking at schools. I have some other things around IDAs that we'll talk about in a little bit that aren't school specific. All right, next up, we have for school-specific funding, CLEP and DSST tests. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these. So they're basically independent organizations that allow the student to test out of typically level 1, level 2 classes. English 101, History 203, so on and so forth. The cool thing about this is that typically the average study time is about a month, and then the test is like 3 or 4 hours. But the costs and the time are the two big factors here. So a CLEP test is about $89. Imagine PCC, or Portland Community College, each credit is $123. So not only are you saving close to $300, you're also saving 3 to 4 months, depending, like if you're on a quarter system, then you're saving about 10 weeks in terms of time. Now, you do have to study unless you're awesome and you just show up and take it. However, here's the caveat. And DSST likely, or in the same vein, has the same kind of testing. They're a little bit more expensive. They're $100 per test. But the caveats here are the school that you attend has limitations on how many of these you can do. So you can't just test out of your entire freshman and sophomore year and then go to Hawaii for the next year because you're done with school for the first 2 years. That would be fun, but that's not how it works. Depending on the school, they might let you do 2 to 4, somewhere in that range. But it's a great way to minimize those small or lower level classes without utilizing the time it takes to do it, and then also freeing up more money. So it's another little tactic you can do on the front end of college to help offset those costs. I have a bonus section for you that's not in your notes. PSU, those of you who are Portland State fans, maybe you're about to be after you listen to what I'm about to say, have two programs for Oregon residents. The first is called 4 for Free. So if you go on PSU's website and just type in their search bar 4 for Free, what you're going to find is a program for high school seniors who are going to go straight from their high school, respective high school, into PSU as a freshman, assuming you hit certain criteria in terms of your GPA. It's not super high. Then they will pay for, and if you maintain said GPA, they will pay for 4 years of your tuition. Significant amount. Now, here's partly why we teach this class now, is that their deadline for that program is June 15th. So if, for example, in the next 5 weeks, you think, change plans, going to PSU, wanted to give you some time to do that. Now, if you're a transfer student, they have a program called, see if you can guess this, Transfer for Free. I'm not making this up. It's on the website. It's the same basic concept for those who are going from Mount Hood, Clackamas, or PCC, or any other kind of college, community college in Oregon, to do the same thing. They'll pay for your tuition, assuming you have a certain amount of GPA. PSU is a pretty decent school, but I like this program because it's just super helpful. Now, you do have to pay for other fees and most books and things like that. But if you're looking to just kind of get the degree and then you can get more specific or go to a bigger name school later for grad school, if that's part of the plan, then this is a good option for you. All right, any questions around, I know I didn't spend a lot of time on the intro on this, but anything on federal funding, state funding, community funding, or school-specific funding before we tackle kind of the individual component, like what can we individually do specifically? Chat's fine, or if you want, you can unmute yourself. You're getting ahead of me, Andrew. That's coming up soon. Nothing? Okay. That's fine. All right, on to individual funding. That's titled this because this kind of moves into what can you as an individual family or individual student focus on. And this is going to hit you differently depending on your dynamics, your variables, how you look at your time, talents, and treasure. It's a nod to Restart. And otherwise, what are your family dynamics? And so each of these things we're going to walk through for the next hour and a bit you're going to have to filter this through your family vision, if you will. Again, another nod to Restart. All right, first up. Now, this might seem Captain Obvious, but I got to start here. Budget. If I were to poll, and I have no data to back this up whatsoever, it's just a gut feeling. If I were to poll how many college students have a budget, a working, functional budget, my guess is that it would be quite low. Probably worse than the average American adult who's not in school. So I'm going to pause here for a second. Teenagers, look at me if you would, please, which hopefully you already are. If you are sitting next to a parent or guardian, I want you to look over at them and say, Mom, Dad, do you know how to budget? Go ahead. Now, Thanks for doing that. If you heard answers like, well, then come talk to me because your parents and I need to have a conversation. But two, they should be able to teach you how to budget, because if they've been at Birch for any length of time, they've taken our classes and they know how to do it. But that's going to be the first thing, is that they need to, if they haven't yet already, parents, this is a nod to you. If you haven't yet taught your kids how to budget and you're talking to them about spending tens of thousands of dollars a year, you need to get on that. If your parents, okay, teens, back to me. If your parents don't know how to budget because they just went, then go find someone who does. Tina and I are available. We can help you work through that. Ask them, your parents, if they don't know how to do it, ask them who can teach me how to budget. Parents, I'm not trying to dog you. I'm just trying to make sure that how crucial this is. Because if a late teen can manage their money well in an enculturated environment that is drastically inadequate, then you are setting them up to go really, really, really far. All right, I'm gonna climb back down off my soapbox and we'll carry on. All right, and this is gonna be another thing that's super obvious. Sell some stuff. Now, this is more so like a one-off thing, but if you're looking for ways to, how do I get some money? This is probably one of the easiest, quickest things. So teens, again, back to me. Just start going around your parents' house and just start grabbing stuff to sell and then tell them about it later. Well, okay, maybe it might be a good idea to tell them, or ask rather, can I sell this to, and parents, like if there are things that you've been wanting to get rid of for like 6 years, but you just haven't gotten to it, you know, the list's a little lower in the priority, then let your kiddos do that to earn a little money for paying for college. Now, again, yes, it's a one-off. It's not going to be a ton, more than likely, but it's the idea behind it, which is how can I find more money to pay for my future? Easy little jump start. And there's always plenty of stuff. If you get to the point where like, I don't have any more stuff, there's always stuff to go get. So that's fine. All right, save money. Another super obvious, but specifically for those who are under 18. So I'm going to talk about 3 different options that are fairly safe. We'll talk about investment options more later, but safe saving options. So first at OnPoint, and they're not the only ones that do this, and this is OnPoint Credit Union. Other credit unions do this as well. They have kids savings accounts or 17 and under savings accounts. The one at OnPoint currently gives 5% interest up to $500. Now, it's not a lot of money, but it is something to get the ball rolling. And then anything over $500 in that particular account just goes to their standard savings rate, which is quite low. But again, good place to start to get the habit of saving money. The next thing I want to talk about is Series I bonds. Tina's smiling because we've been talking about this pretty heavily for the last couple of months. So if you've got time, and time here is anything basically over 5 years, I'm going on the conservative side of time. You could do it sooner than that. I would recommend this. So here's the lowdown on Series I bonds. First, they are Treasury given bonds. So you go to the US Treasury and give them money and they give you a bond. It's a form of debt. Now, you're not going into debt. The country's going into more debt, which that's another conversation. But they have 2 interest rates that are given. One is a fixed rate, which is currently at 0%. And everyone said, what? And has been at 0 for quite some time. The other interest rate that they give on this Series I bond is connected to the inflation rate. And they use the CPI index for that. And that rate is 9.25%. 9.62%. I did not make that up. That is as of May 1st, so 5 days ago. Thanks, Tina, for putting that in the chat. It will be at 9.62% for the next 6 months. So they do 6-month increments. The previous 6 months prior to May 1st was 7.14%. Still fairly significant. And for what we can see in terms of interest rates, that's not going to slow down anytime soon. So for example, if you purchase $10,000, I know it's a lot, but if you put $10,000 into a Series I bond, which is the max, you can do an extra $5,000, but it has to be with your tax return and paper bonds. But these are digital online bonds. Then for $10,000, that $10,000 for the next 6 months, we'll be getting 9.62% interest at almost risk-free rate. A couple caveats, because this stuff always comes with caveats. First is that you can't touch it for a year. So one way you could look at this is like it's a retirement, or it's college money. We can't touch it. It's not part of the plan. So you can't touch it for a year. After a year, up to year 5, if you do touch the money, then you will forfeit the last 3 months worth of interest. So functionally, you might lose 2 to 3% interest that year on the year that you take it before 5 years. After 5 years, so if you've left the money in there for 5 years, then it's all yours whenever you want. So this is at this point in time, this is a really good, safe way to grow money, particularly for college, but you could also do it for other stuff as well. Another option to consider, it's somewhere in between, well, way down on the line, it's online banks. So if you're thinking, we don't have a year, we only have a few months, well, then online banks might be the way to go. Fairly, well, it is safe. But right now they're giving like 0.6%, which is, yeah, it's quite low. But it's been that way for some time. In other words, it's better than the brick and mortar banks that you might have your savings currently at. Good question, Sabrina. What's the difference between Series I and Series EE? I was not prepared for that question. Give me a sec if I have it in my notes. I don't. Tina, oh, thank you. Did you just put up the comparison? Thank you. So I am going to punt this question because I can't answer that very well, Sabrina, to Tina's link that she put up. Heather, can you only open one bond or can you get multiple? You can get multiples. It's $10,000 cap per person per year. So if there's like 8 of you in the house and you've got $80,000 just hanging out, you could, in theory, buy $80,000 worth of Series I bonds. Thanks for those questions. All right, moving on from saving stuff. Now we're going to talk about if you're in high school. All right, so for those of you who are like 4, don't check out, but this is going to be hard to track with. If you're already in college, this is not going to be applicable to you. And if you're like 61 thinking about going back to school, this is also not going to be applicable to you. However, you probably know someone who is in high school. So please, for that reason, track. So if you're in high school, first thing to consider, right, is grades. Now, schools, when they look at accepting a student, not so much at the community college level, but at the 4-year approach. Now, this kind of path now, I'm focusing primarily on traditional community college or 4-year schools. So schools look at the total student, or another way to say that is the portfolio of the student, not just grades. Grades play a big part of it, but they're not the only thing. Now, if your student is an average student, there's nothing wrong with that. Average is average. There's nothing wrong with that. But you can't expect high scholarships for average grades. You just can't. Now, you can have average grades and qualify for more need-based if you do have that setup. So you have to be realistic about your students' capabilities, the time that you have left to increase that GPA particularly, but it's okay because there are other ways to make up for weaker areas in the portfolio. So of course, this is an area where AP classes play into that. It's weighted differently, so it gives you more boost, but it also can go take it the other way because it's a heavier weighted class. Some people say that, well, your first year doesn't really matter and your last year doesn't really matter. It's just those middle 2 years. That's not true. All years matter. And for a couple reasons. One, schools don't just look at the final 3-point whatever. They look at the trajectory of the student from day one all the way through to the end. Now, when you're applying, typically in the fall, you're usually a juniors or you're in your senior year, so that hasn't really come through. So some students make the mistake that, oh, I can take my foot off the gas and relax. The problem is you're going to report that year later on after you've been accepted, and there are plenty of times where students get unaccepted because of what took place their senior year. Another thing is schools are also looking at the kind of classes that you're taking. So if a school sees this growing trajectory, so if you start as a freshman, you're at like 2.3 GPA, and you're working hard, you have a heavy class load, and you end up at like a 3.4, that says more than someone who's got a 3.8, whose workload was way light. Because people read and pay attention to this stuff. So when you're thinking about your schedule as a family, think about not just like, okay, this is all for getting into college, because I don't want to make that mistake when talking about this, because you do want to learn and you want to do well because that's good stewardship. But the goal here is not to just punt all of life so we can get 4.3 GPA, we can get into that school, so we can get the good job, so we can, that's not it. But this is part of the process. All right, dual enrollment. Andrew, here we go. And one of you also asked about this. Homeschoolers, what about homeschoolers? What specifically is your question? Are you talking like, can homeschoolers do dual enrollment? Yes. Actually, Tina and I's niece and nephew were both homeschoolers and are doing dual enrollment currently. Or one is doing like tri-enrollment. She's a rock star. And you happen to know who she is, but I won't say her name. With regards to grades, yes, they still look at that. Tina could actually probably speak to this because she's just looking at me going, wait, what? I'm going to brag on her. She was homeschooled and was a National Merit Scholar. So yes, grades do matter. So in terms of like Shemeketa discontinued program, you mean the dual enrollment? Is that what you're referring to, Mark? Okay. I'm sorry to hear that. But up in this area, Clark, Clackamas, and Mount Hood are busting at the seams for dual enrollment. Why I like this is that if the student can handle the workload, because it's a heavier workload to do dual enrollment. So you're in high school, but you're taking college level classes. The good news is that you really only have to pay for books because the school pays for the tuition fees. You don't do that as a student. The school pays for that once you get into the program. And not everyone has to go full gangbusters and graduate as a senior, graduate high school with an associate's. Now that's the full map of the program, but you don't have to do that. If you can get a year done that's also good, but it's a way to speed up the timeline and to maximize your capability in high school if you can handle that. Nothing wrong if you don't do it. So Running Start is the name in Washington, and in Oregon, I don't know if it's got a technical name. Someone might know it. It's just dual enrollment, high school, college. Each of those three schools have a different name for it. Let's talk about tests, specifically, again, in high school, the SAT, ACT. There are lots of good resources out there. Tina's going to put one in the chat here for like tutoring help, resources for this. Now, not everyone, actually a small percentage of people actually test well on the ACT, SAT, because it's focusing primarily on your math logical side of how you think. And of course, it does have writing and comprehension and such. But for those of you who aren't good test takers, it's okay to not have high scores. Again, think of the total package, the portfolio. So again, if this is an area where you're weak in and you know you're not a good test taker, don't stress too much about it. Yes, take the tests. Do it junior year, and then you can take it a couple of times and they'll take your highest score up to a certain amount of tests. And if you can get a 1290 and then like, that's as good as you can get, awesome. But your grades are like 3.8, 3.9. All right, now you're starting to round out. So there is ways to piece this together. All right, part-time jobs. So in Oregon and Washington, the minimum legal age to work to get a W-2 is 14. Now, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a place like Wendy's that hires a 14-year-old. Now, I bring up Wendy's because that was my first job, like first W-2 job, excuse me, at 15. I just turned 15. A week later, I got the job at a brand new Wendy's. Because at that point, Wendy's was only hiring 15-year-olds. And I remember learning we learned a song on how to like appropriately put condiments on a burger. I don't remember the song, so don't ask me to sing it, but there are options. And so if you find yourself, you're 14, 15-year-old, willing to work, which I would encourage this, and ready, then what I would encourage is go to your network first. So parents, I know you know people who know people, and you can pitch your kid to your people's people and be like, hey, my kid's awesome. He can sweep a floor like nobody's business. Can you give him an opportunity? And that's how it starts. I want to pair this part-time job with internships. Again, value perspective here. It is never too early to start doing internships. And why do you say that? Do you know? My school doesn't even require internships. Great. I'm gonna talk about this also at the college level, but I'll wait to get that part going later. Internships are a great way to do lots of things. One, experience working with people, experience in responding to people in different dynamics, building professional style relationships, even if you're just helping someone swing a hammer versus an office environment. You're learning cultural dynamics around fields of work and areas of occupation. You're building your network. Should a 15-year-old have a network? Absolutely. Same purpose as a 45-year-old should have a network. Relational capital. Not to capitalize on primarily, but to be a tool to be an avenue of value-giving opportunity. And as the 14, 15, 6-year-old learns how to do this at this space, confidence comes from this, experience comes from this, resume building comes from this. Yes, camp counselors or helpers at teen camps, great place to do that. So if you're thinking about getting a job, plus you get to make money, that's also a cool side effect. about working. Think strategically about the kind of job. So for example, if you're a young person, and I'm going to tip a little bit too, this applies if you're just about to go to college or already in college. Let's say you have an interest in becoming an engineer, for example, just general engineer. Maybe you want to do aircraft, maybe you want to do machinery, maybe you want to do cars, maybe you want to do solar panels, whatever, just generally. But you're like 15, so you don't have an engineering degree. So how would you start? So I had this conversation with a woman years ago whose son wanted to be an engineer. In particular, he wanted to go work at Boeing, but he's 15. He was a sophomore in high school, going to be a junior soon. And so I said, all right, here's the plan. I want you to go to Boeing and literally knock on the front door. I'm not making this up, which is like their admin office over off of Sandy. And I want you to introduce yourself and your son and say, okay, what's the process for someone like me to get into the building and help or have an internship or something like that? So she's like, fine, I'll take you up on this ridiculous idea. So she goes to Boeing, and the receptionist is like, what on earth are you doing here? She didn't say it that way, but that was the tone. She's like, the receptionist had no point of reference for what this family was trying to do. And I was encouraging them, say, do not leave until you talk to someone. And that takes a lot of guts to just stand there in front of a reception desk and get told, like, you can't just show up here. Like, well, we just did because the door's open and here we are. So they continued to have this conversation and explain what he was trying to do. And finally, she was just like, all right, whatever, I'll call somebody. So she called somebody. I don't even know who it was. Okay, they came down, they told the story again, and they were so intrigued by what he was doing that they're like, all right, why don't you come back next week at such and such time, and we'll figure out some kind of practical thing. So he comes back, they leave, they come back the next week, and they sit down and they have a conversation about what would it look like to just have a mini little internship down just past Birch a little bit on Sandy. So about half an hour later, this kid has an internship at Boeing at almost 16. So you never know what could happen when you just start knocking on doors. And the idea here is at an early age, in my view, not only as someone who's worked with teens for a long time, worked with young adults for decades, but have kids of my own, is that the natural ingredients, the raw ingredients are already there. And we get to create the environment and have opportunities to contextualize those raw ingredients to then start bubbling to the surface, practically speaking. And so here's a phrase I want you to sit on, and some of you know this because I've talked to you about this before, is to test your interests in the ecosystem of those interests. So another example of this conversation I had with a young woman, she was interested in forensics, probably because she could quote like however many CSI episodes back to me, particularly CSI Miami. And so I asked her, I said, have you ever been to a forensics lab? And she's like, no. Well, it's interesting because there's like 4, maybe 5 of them in this area. Sheriff office, counties, FBI, Homeland Security, like there's multiple of those in this area. And it kind of clicked that like you can do that. This is pre-pandemic, so it's a lot easier, but it's still possible now because things are lifting. I said, yes, because you have to get into the ecosystem of your interests to test whether or not what's in your head matches the reality of that context. Because watching something on TV and getting, oh, that'd be fun, versus actually being in a cold, sterile environment, where your senses start picking stuff up. Granted, taste is not going to work well in that environment, but some of the other ones, you're going to know real quick. Nope, this is not what I had in mind. And that's the power and the value of being deliberate with your part-time work and your paid internships or non-paid internships, no matter how old. Now, it's also good to have some of those jobs that you just hate, because it's a really, really powerful point of reference to be in a position to be like, yep, never want to do that again. That wasn't fun. Excuse me. All right, next thing to talk about while you're in high school is volunteering. And on specifically this idea of going deep and wide. So schools love to see a volunteer experience. They want to see a breadth of volunteer experience, different types in different places to show different interests. And yet they also want to see depth. They want to see your passions. They want to see the things that you're interested in. This is also another place where you can test your interests. And it's also, if you have a 14-year-old at Birch, it's a great way, parents, to you not have to do your volunteer hours and pawn it off to your kids. That's a win-win right there. So again, what you're trying to do from one perspective, not the only perspective, is you're building out your portfolio to not just position yourself to get into the next school, but to really understand, how am I wired, what's meaningful to me, and how do I steward those natural raw ingredients to create value in the marketplace? That's what I think what's really going on here. Instead of spending your summers and evenings rocking your thumbs. All right, let's talk about the infamous gap year. So let's say graduate high school and you're excited. You're, all right, let's do this. I don't know if I want to go to school yet. I don't know if I'm ready. So I told you my experience from high school to my first year of college. I was not academically ready. There were some other variables and things going on in life as to why I felt I needed to do this. But the gap year does a pretty powerful thing. One, and this is the year, and this is popular in the Commonwealth. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, England, where after high school, you take a year off and you typically travel in those environments. But here you can use it to work, volunteer, test ideas, start a business, save some money, maybe dabble with a couple of classes, maybe do some CLEP and DSST work. It gives you a lot of opportunity, and it gives you a chance to mature a little bit. Gap years provide a really potent tool. Now, what happens if you get this great scholarship and you want to take a gap year? And the great scholarship is for you to start in the fall. Well, the options are to ask the scholarship organization, the foundation, how do you deal with gap years? Do you deal with gap years? So if you're thinking of already you're going to do a gap year, then it'd be good as you're applying for scholarships to see if that's an option. Some won't do it, absolutely, for sure. Others will. So another story for you. In my time after I paid off the student loans and I told you I went overseas, I lived in New Zealand for 3.5 years doing missions work with a fun organization. And one of the students that I was leading, she was from England and she was on her gap year. And she told us a story, and she was a smart cookie, of how she got into Oxford and she was getting ready to go. And she said, oh, by the way, I'm planning to take a gap year. And Oxford said, good for you. We don't do gap years. So she thought about it for a minute. I went, fine, I'll go to my next college. which I believe was Cambridge. So she got accepted to Oxford and Cambridge, and she went through to Cambridge and said, oh, by the way, I'm taking a gap year because I'm going to do this missions training program for 6 to 9 months overseas. They said, that's nice, kid, have fun. Not going to do it. She said, okay, fine. So she passed up on not just Oxford or Cambridge. Her next school is Notre Dame in England, Notre Dame. And they said, no, please take your gap year. Because I told you, she was a smart cookie. Fast forward, she got her doctorate at 24. So she left at 19. She came to us at 18, left at 19. 5 years later, she got her PhD and she's teaching again at Notre Dame. So gap years can play a pretty powerful role in your personal development as well as economic opportunities, although it's hard to see in the moment. It's a little trickier to work around, but it is an option, especially if you're not quite ready financially. Then it buys you another year to get ready. Or if you're not quite sure what you want to study, there's also a chance to do that. All right, one more bonus in the high school section piece. This, again, not your notes. So I talked about making sure you don't slack your senior year. Another thing to consider, this is a nuanced piece, but it could be really powerful in terms of getting into a particular school, which is the letters of recommendation. So often schools will ask for, give us 2-3 letters of recommendation, family member or friend, a professional referent like a workplace, and then one of your teachers, or something like that. Some of you might have seen this in the news. I think it was about 3-4 years ago now, of a young man who wanted to get, I believe it was Boston College, a Ivy League-ish school in the Northeast. And he was an average student. He wasn't stellar by any sense of the word. He was he tactically met the qualifications, but did not stand out. But what got him into the school was a particular letter of recommendation from his janitor at his high school. And we know about the story because the particular admissions counselor, when she was looking at his stuff, just stopped at that letter and just sat there and went, I can't believe I'm reading a letter from a janitor at a high school. That's the first she has ever seen, specifically of a janitor, but from a category of people that are typically not included in a student's academic career. And the janitor went on in the letter, she just kind of gave a summary of it to describe the kind of kid he was. He would often stay after and help him. Didn't need to, just chose to. Had a great attitude. And it made the letter made such an impression on the admissions counselor. She took it to the team and said, we have to let this kid in because of who he is. His grades were average, his scores were meh. He did some other things, like a typical student, but that letter sealed the deal. Now the kid did not, when they talked to him later, he wasn't working an angle. He didn't think, oh, if I ask a janitor, they're going to give me an in. Like, who thinks that? He liked the janitor. He wanted to do something different, and he did. So when you think about looking for letters of recommendation, think, who has insight into my life that someone reading it would have to just pause and go, okay, that's different. Because that's really what a letter of recommendation is giving you insight into the character and future development trajectory of a student in your particular school. So when you're thinking about that, think of ways that you can get creative there. All right, we're going to move on to college now, for those of you who are in college or about to go to college. But particularly when you're there, what can you do to help position yourself now, not so much to get in the school, but to continue to be funded while you're there and then give you opportunities when you're done. So of course, grades do matter in college. There's the classic D's get degrees. True. D's do not get jobs necessarily. And sure, you could go to Walmart or Target in my case, not because I got D's, but because they needed people and they were kind of desperate. So yes, it does technically, I guess, lead to a degree, but is that good stewardship? Is that good value creation on your part as a student? I would argue no. That doesn't mean you can't struggle, but we're not shooting for D's here because, again, that's poor stewardship. That's not value creation. But the better that you can maintain your grades through college, the more opportunities you can to keep maybe your original scholarship or to apply for later year scholarships, because they do change typically. So the funding sometimes will shift. They might give you more money for as a junior or senior if you're maintaining solid grades. Again, depends on the school and the funding available. Rent or buy used books. All right, so books are stupid, ridiculous, expensive in college. Publishers gotta feel like they're important, so they'll just crank out edition after edition after edition, and they change like 6 words in a 400-page book. You're like, come on, really? And charge you $180 for it, when you can Google that stuff in 30 seconds, right? So, as best you can, rent or buy used books. In the handout that was given to you via the email that Becca sent, there was a link to 2 pages. One had scholarships and the other one had links to where to rent or where to buy used books. If you're like, I can't find that, don't know where that is, feel free to email us and we can get that to you. But it's like probably 8 to 10 different websites to be able to get used books. All right, got another story for you. When I was in grad school, we had a problem. So my wife and I went to grad school at the same time. Usually not the cheapest thing on the planet to do, but we chose to do it. And there's more to that story that I will share a little later. Yeah, some of them are, Brandy. They still cost just almost as much. So the program at the time required every student to have their own set of brand new books. It was part of the package. So when you showed up to this particular program that my wife and I were a part of, when you paid for the tuition, you couldn't separate and pay for the book separately. It was a package deal. The sticker price was the whole bit. Well, we were like, we don't study at the same time because she was home with the little guy and I was working. And so we appealed our advisor and said, hey, we don't need 2 sets of books. We can share because we study at different times and we can pass the books back and forth in class, just like we were passing notes and back and forth in class, which is a lot of fun, by the way. And he said no. I said, oh, okay. Well, me being me, I said, no, I'm not good enough with that answer. So I go to his boss, which is she was the head of the program. And we appealed to her. Here's our situation. We don't need 2 sets of books. Can we please not pay for 2 sets of books? She said no. All right, you're forcing my hand here. I like you, but I'm going to go over your head. So I went to the dean of academics for the whole school. So you had my advisor, which was over our cohort, and then you had his boss, which was over the program, and then over her was the academic dean of the entire school. So I'm running out of options at this point. And so I write him, here's a situation. I didn't tell him that the previous 2 people said no. I just played it like it was the only one. He said, yeah, sure, go for it. Why don't you test it for a month or 2 and then let me know how it goes? I said, absolutely. I will absolutely test that and get back to you and let you know how it goes. And then, by the way, it's going to go great. Because the difference between buying 2 sets of books versus 1 set of books was almost $4,000. And those 3 letters and conversations took me about an hour and a half worth of time. That is probably the best wage I have ever gotten my entire life. So it's worth to ask. Another thing you could do is you go straight to the professor or teacher and ask them, yes, I see these lists of books are required, but do I actually need to buy them? Is there a different way I can get at it? Can I just get printouts of certain pages? Back to my undergrad, there were certain books that were just way too expensive. I didn't feel like paying for it. And so I would get on the waiting list at the library, at the school's library, to check out that particular book. But I wasn't the only kid doing that. I say kid, I was like 33 at the time. I wasn't the only one doing that. And so sometimes I'd have to wait till 11, 12 o'clock at night until that book came back, and then read till 3, 4 in the morning in preparation for the. So that side effect wasn't so great, but it did save me a little bit of money. So there are options. Take a look at those lists of websites and just ask. All right, back to internships. So when you're in high school, I recommend 2 internships. When you're in college, I recommend 3. Do you know? That's 5 internships. I've never heard of anybody doing 5 internships. Exactly. You might have 1 that's required in high school, maybe, depending on the high school. And you're probably going to have at least 1, maybe 2, maybe in the college level. So why am I suggesting you do more? Well, consider the ramifications of 5 internships. Consider the 5 different opportunities, the 5 different sets of relationships, the 5 different contexts to learn and create new skills, the confidence that comes from having 5 internships before you're 21. That's a potent amount of experience. And speaking of experience, how many of you, if you just got your degree, tried rocking on up to a job that you felt qualified for, but the interviewer was like, you don't have enough experience? This many internships will help solve that problem. Part-time jobs, there's all kinds of studies out there that says while you're in college, working at least 15 to 19 hours a week will cause your grades to go up comparative to peers who do not work. Multiple studies across multiple years have confirmed this. So if you're like, well, I don't want my kid to work, I want them to focus. You want them to focus, get them to work. And they have to focus because they have 15 to 19 less hours to study with. So they got to get creative in their time management and prioritize other things. Plus you make money. In my case, I talked to you about the federal work study. This led to a relationship with my boss, who, by the way, happened to be really good friends with the financial aid director at Warner Pacific College. So when the time came for my tenure at Target to end, I saw that posting come up, and I wasn't necessarily excited to go back into financial aid, but I was desperate because I had a boot on my foot because I had messed up my ankle on my first day at the job at Target. So that's fun. And thinking, man, I can't do Target. I like Target, but I can't make a living here. I saw the position come up. I called my old boss and I said, can you please, Mary, call them? And absolutely, done. So I interviewed for the position. This is all going back to the work study and the part-time job during college. And so interview for the position. He takes forever to get back to me. And he calls me up and he says, all right, you're hired. And he said, oh, by the way, Mary told me to hire you. That was it. Next thing, full-time job and night school. This will keep you busy. This is not an easy schedule. When I came back from overseas and I had gone back to school for the third time, so it was after I paid the debt off, after I was in New Zealand, I came back and I got a job at Trader Joe's. And I started going to school full time. And I was super nervous because my academic history was not awesome. Yet I needed to do something, and I felt more confident. I felt a lot more humble and more deliberate on what I want to pursue. So when I went back to school, it was super exciting to me, and I loved every minute of it. But my schedule was a bit rough. So my work week started on Sunday and went through Thursday. So to give you a little bit of taste of how much fun this isn't, I started work on 4 o'clock on Sunday so I could do church in the morning. So I started work 4 on Sunday, worked till midnight, started back at work at 8 in the morning, got off at 4:30 Monday, went to class from 6 to 10 at night. Started work the next morning at 6 a.m. Got off work Tuesday at 2:30, went to class 6 to 10. Wednesday morning, back at work at 6, off at 2:30, study, go back to school 6 to 10 Wednesday night. The next morning, Thursday morning, back at work at 6, off at 2:30, study, class 6 to 10. Come home the next day, I have off and I sleep into like noon, basically. And I repeated that for about a year and a bit. So at the time, I also got a scholarship to go to community college and a Cal grant, which is a pretty robust grant because I lived in California at the time. And I got paid to go to school. That was fun. And then, which meant I got to save all the extra money on top of that because I was working full-time and doing school. So it's possible, but I just didn't sleep much. And then I met my wife during that time, which is then even trickier to do that kind of schedule and try and court somebody, but it was totally worth it. Tina would agree with that. The next option in terms of work is this concept of, well, full-time job, but then class stacking. And this is the idea where you stack your classes like on a Monday and a Wednesday. And this really only works if you're at a bigger school. So if you're at a small little private school with like 300 people, it's probably not going to work. But if you're at a big school, U of O, PSU, something like that, this will work. And so you can stack all your classes Monday and Wednesday and then work Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or something to that effect. So it's a way to blend the both if you're in a position where you have to do that. And it's not just adult degree programs that do that. So the full-time job at night school was both my associate's route and my master's route, which I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Another thing to consider is called accelerated learning. And this is where you get the idea, good job, Heather, of maxing out the credits. So most schools offer, you pay per credit, pay per credit, pay per credit until you hit credit 12 through 18. Then they offer block pricing. Most schools do this. So you pay the same amount of money for 12 credits as you do as 18 credits. Now, granted, that's like 4 classes versus 6 or 7, depending on the credit load. But your money's going to go farther by getting up to that 18 credit mark. And then anything above 18 credits is at a discounted rate. So the one semester I did 20 credits at Multnomah, so this is my undergrad. I was also doing an internship and then still working in the financial aid office. That was a rough semester. It's a lot of credits. I wasn't doing it all the time. I just did it for that one round, but I was typically at the 17 mark. It's possible, but remember, this is not forever. So when you can put a timeline on something for something specific, again, this should sound familiar to some of you at Restart about working an extra amount. Now, if you're a single parent and you've got 3 kids, this is probably going to be hard to do. But if you can say, okay, for 6 months, I can rock out this nasty schedule because then after that, I'll be good. Or whatever the time frame is, it's a lot easier to go through something that intense. All right, discounts. So when you're at the school, think or look for ways to get discounts. So some classic ones, particularly if you live on campus, for example, is becoming an RA, resident advisor. Typically what happens if you become an RA, your room and board is paid for by the school. Now you kind of have to put on your parenting hat at that point when you become an RA and you got to deal with some nonsense, but it's a decent amount of money for just a little bit of work and some headaches here and there. Or you work at the place of your residence. So if you're renting an apartment or you're renting a room in someone's house, bartering essentially to do work around the place, whatever shape or form that looks like, so that you don't have to pay or reduce what you pay so that you can repurpose that money towards help paying the bills, particularly for college, is a good way to go. Nice. Thanks for sharing that, Brandon. Becoming a teacher's assistant, if you have that skill set, or a research assistant. Again, that's good. That's a small niche group, but it does exist and it's still possible to get it. And then, of course, classic alumni discount. So if your parents went to a school, if your sibling went to a school, if your great-great-grandfather went to a particular school, it might peter out at that point if it's too far removed. But if you got a good story, maybe they might, or if your great-great-grandfather did something awesome, or grandmother, you might be able to get on those coattails. Similar to the gap year is the idea of spreading out the degree. I had shared with you that it took me 15 years, the scenic route. So I have a question for you. This is rhetorical, unless you really feel the need or urge to answer this. Who said that you must do a bachelor's degree in 4 years? I don't think it was Edison. It might have been Jefferson. But who said? Why not 5 years? Why not 6? Why not 7? So my point here is that go at the pace that makes sense to you, your finances, and the trajectory of your value creating path. Now, the arguments that say, Heather, I'll address that in a second. The arguments that say, well, look at the statistics of those who start and drop out. And look at the statistics that those that drop out and restart and go again and finish. So the point is not about statistics, it's what makes sense to you in your situation. Now, yes, Heather, there are programs that you don't have the option to spread it out. So if that's the case, you know that's going to be the case, so plan accordingly. So if there's an 18-month program, like the one that my wife and I did, there are ways to stretch that, called breaks, FMLA leave. There are ways to do it. Now in my wife's case, she had a kid, so we just didn't make that up. But you can plan for it. So if you know it's going to be an 18-month program, then you might not be ready to start it next month or in 6 months. You might have to wait 2 years to prepare yourself, to build up the funds in case. So some programs you can stretch it, others it's locked and loaded, and that's what it is what you have to work with. All right, we're going to pivot a little bit here and talk a little bit about IDAs. And I briefly mentioned this a little bit ago. These are individual development accounts. Now, these 4 links have to do with 4 different organizations that manage IDAs. Again, individual development accounts, they're glorified savings programs with typically 300% rate of return, which is you put $1 in and the program matches $3. Most of these, however, are heavy need-based. So if you make too much, you don't qualify. That's the tricky part. But if you're on the lower side of things, lower is relative to your family dynamic, I would definitely look into it. But you can't get an Oregon IDA to fund you in Washington. Got to stay in the state. They typically give you quite a bit of time to save up for it, and we'll keep the funds in there. And most of these are $12,000 caps. So you put in 3,000 and then they match up to 9. And you can usually only have one IDA program at a time. You can't go to all 4 and open up 4 different IDAs and just start dropping money everywhere. They won't let you do that. One at a time. But if you get an IDA for your associates and then try and get another IDA for your bachelor's, because there's a time gap, that does count, and you can do that. All right, another vehicle, savings vehicle that's in the investment space. I'll talk about a couple here, but this one's a little bit outdated, but you can still get it. It's called an ESA, or the technical name, if you really want to know, is Cloverdale Education Savings Account. There's a cap here of $2,000 per child per year. The 529 plan, that's a really high cap. It's essentially, there isn't one. But you get into tax issues though if you put too much in. And so the 529 has a lot of flexibility, a lot of options. ESA is this was first before the 529 plan. Some other ones in the investment space that are not on here is a UGMA or UTMA account. They're acronyms. They're investment based, and they're essentially, you as a parent manage these accounts on behalf of the student. And then once the student comes of age, namely 18, the money's theirs. The downside to a UGMA or UTMA account is that the child at 18 will go, "Thanks, mom and dad. I'm heading to Vegas. I'll see you later." And you have no say whatsoever on the money. Now, you can say all you want, like, please don't do that. That's foolish. But legally, it's their money. They can do whatever they want with it. It doesn't have to be used for anything. They can use it for anything. That's the downside. Another option is a custodial Roth IRA. Like the 529 plan, it's after tax funded. So once your income has been taxed, you can have a custodial Roth. So you own it until the child becomes 18 and it's theirs. And you can put money into that and it grows tax-free. Now, typically Roth, you can't touch it until you're 59 and a half. But if you use it for qualified education expenses, you don't get the penalty, that 10% penalty. So you don't have to pay tax because it grows tax-free. But if you use it for education expenses on or through the Roth, you won't get that 10% pre-59 and a half age penalty. So there's some options here if you want to get a little creative, or if you're not a fan of locking the money in a 529, which is only education related expenses. All right, any questions before we deep dive into the scholarship world? How are we doing? Doing okay? All right, the scholarship search, the dreaded scholarship search. So Dino, is there actually millions and millions of dollars that I keep hearing and reading about? My academic counselor, school counselor tells me about? Yes, it does exist, but it takes work. And often a lot of what I've been saying sounds like it's going to take a lot of work, and it's true, and it does. But one particular, this is especially true if you're in high school or you're really needing scholarship money because there's not enough family money. You're working all you can, but the gap's just too big for whatever reason. And because of this and your approach, because of Birch, we're not doing debt. So one option is to treat this like a part-time job. So you flip that switch on that says, all right, I'm going to be spending 10, 15 hours a week working through scholarships. Now, in the back of the handouts that we gave you, if you printed them off or if you're looking at them digitally, there's a long list of scholarships. Good question, Heather. Scholarships start as young as freshmen. So you can get they're rare, but you can get a scholarship as a freshman, but you'll have to maintain certain things in order to keep it, in order for that student to get it when they become a freshman in college. Of course, the older you get, the more likely it's heavier on juniors and seniors. But you can start as a freshman. So the list that I gave you, there are 10 different scholarship websites. Now, this isn't just, I did not just Google the top 10 scholarship and just throw this on a page. I've been looking at these for years. Some of them I used personally decades ago. And I've looked at other bloggers in the finance space, particularly for college planning, and cross-reference other lists like top 10 lists. Yes, I did start a Google, but then buried after that. So these are the ones that consistently show up as meaningful, as valuable, as legitimate. And each of those is, you'll create a profile of the student. And the more specific that you input the data, the more refined your search becomes. If you go too narrow, you're going to end up with a few. If you go too broad, the only thing you'll be doing is filling out scholarships, and probably not for things that you'll actually get. So I can't tell you, so Dino, what are you telling me? Like, how big should the profile be? I can't tell you exactly what that is. But pick the things that are going to have the biggest meaning or the biggest impact. Your particular interests, what you plan to study, what your work experience or what you want to do in the future. Yeah, I probably wouldn't put in like, I like tubas, but I don't like guitars. It's probably not going to help. Unless you're a tuba player, then by all means, go after that. Then so I said there's 10. Then there's 2 that are specific to women only. One is called Soroptimist.org. I'm not going to spell that because you can see it it's there in the link. And the other one is particularly for single moms, called PEO International. So both are for women only, Soroptimist.org, and then particularly for single moms, it's PEO International. Thanks, Tina. And then there are 2 really random things, and that's why it's under the category of random, which is Walmart and Lowe's. And they do have national scholarships. Now, when you go that broad, that big, the competition pool is massive. So the likelihood, right, drops in terms of how you'll get it, or if you'll get it. All right, so back to approach. So again, focus on, in terms of scholarship, your school first. We talked a little bit about that in the high school space. If you know what school you're going to go to, focus on making sure your path is aligned to those scholarships, because it's the easiest thing to do. And probably the thing that's going to give you the most money consistently. When it comes to writing the application, particularly the essays and answering questions, this is where I'm going to really get super granular here, because this is kind of a make or break space in the scholarship space. So essays, I talked a little bit about this on Tuesday night. I said there were 3 things. I think there's actually 4. One is honesty. 2 is it's creative. And I'll give you an example of it in a minute. You need to be articulate. You don't have to be the best writer. Right? I've given lots of money to students who are doing auto mechanics who are terrible writers. Like, it's just painful to read because yeah. And then it needs to be specific essays specifically to the questions that are being asked. So for example, often many scholarships will ask a question along the lines of, tell me about a time when you volunteered and it impacted you, or it had a major impact on your life. If you start the sentence with, the one time I had a volunteer experience that impacted my, I'm done reading and you're not getting money, period. Remember, I used to be on the Mount Hood Community College Scholarship Committee, and I've read a whole lot of these. And if that's how it started, I would not read the rest of it. Next. So please, don't start the essay that way. Instead, what I would recommend, and what has got my attention the most, is something like this. It was 4:53 on a Tuesday afternoon, and her name was Jen. All of a sudden, I'm like, humans read this stuff, right? After you submit and the computer checks for appropriate words to make sure it gets to a human. If I'm a human and that's the first thing I read, I want to know what the heck happened on a Tuesday night at 4:53 and who's Jen? You have my attention. That is what people want, because by the time they get to your essay and your application, they've probably read 30. You know how brain dead that person is by the time they've read not like even 5 of those things? So like my personal rule when I would do it, I would read at most like 10 at a time. And that was pushing it. So honest. If you didn't do something, don't write about it. Don't embellish. Call it what it is. Creativity. It's about like massaging the story so that it's interesting to read, and that the creative and articulate kind of come together. And then the specifics. Be really, really specific. So in that example, it was Tuesday night, 4:53 p.m. and her name was Jen. We'll talk about what happened at 4:53 and why does Jen matter? What you're inviting the reader into your life. So include them in your life. Tell a story. Now, this is not your chance to do creative writing. This is not a creative writing class because you're trying to do something specific. You're getting their attention to try and convince them to give you money. That's what you're doing. So if the question asks for something specific, answer specifically the question. I could tell you a whole bunch of times where we would ask a very simple question and they did not answer the question. In the meantime, there's a stack of like 400 applicants that want that money, and somebody got lazy and just generalized. Also, another piece to keep in mind on the scholarship front is research the funder. Get to know the funder. So in Oregon, you have the Ford Foundation, probably the biggest education funder in Oregon. You must read the story of the Fords, not Henry Ford back in Michigan, but the Fords in Oregon. You must read their story. What do they get excited about? What do they like? Why does their foundation exist? What other projects have they funded? What other things are they interested in? You can read all this on the website. It's all right there. If you don't see enough, then just go down the Google route and start digging stuff up. And then as you write your essay, you want to give nod to, expression to some of those things that they are into. Because it's in one way you're honoring the funder by saying, I know who you are. Now, if you're sitting there going, oh, this is not what I had in mind for scholarship search, Absolutely, because 95% of students will not do this. They won't take the time to do this. They'll write one mediocre essay and then copy the paste the snot out of that thing to 50 different scholarship searches. If you do that, guess what the reader's going to do? They're going to know exactly, because it doesn't quite fit, because it's not specific enough. It doesn't match the foundation. The tone is off. Like, we're trained to pick this stuff up as a reader. I'm a former reader. I'm not doing it now. So please do not copy and paste. If you've got an awesome story, don't just plop that same story and tweak it a little bit to contextualize it to that foundation or that school or that funder. This is why I think you need to treat it like a part-time job, because it takes more work, this approach. But it will highly increase your chances of getting the scholarship. All right, it's 8:32. I still have some more things I want to go through. So I'd ask for a little bit more time. Again, if you do need to leave, feel free. But we're still going to keep on trucking, because I have a couple more bits here that I think will still be helpful. Again, there's two main categories here: need versus merit. Need-based is financial, you need it financially, you don't make enough, there's not enough resources. Merit is based on your abilities and skill sets. It's typically, there's going to be more money on the merit-based. Those scholarships tend to be bigger than the need-based. So if you're going to focus somewhere, focus on your school, then focus on the merit-based stuff. And then, of course, track, because these scholarships have different deadlines, different requirements at different times. So make sure that you're keeping track of this, so you're not applying for the same scholarship to two different platforms. All right, let's talk about employer assistance or reimbursement. So there's some organizations like Target, Starbucks, Nike, Intel, Boeing, that all help pay for not only your current degree, but if you did have a degree, they'll help pay off some of that debt. But in this case, it won't matter because you're not doing debt. So I'm going to go back to my story here. When I left Target and went to work for Warner Pacific College as a financial aid counselor, one of their perks was employer assistance or employer reimbursement for grad school, because we both had our degrees by then. And interestingly, there was another component to this as to why I finally jumped, which was, at the time, Warner would cover 100% of my grad school costs. I just have to pay for the books, which, if you heard earlier, I got that written off, and fees. The kicker was that they would fund 80% of my wife's. And so we would only have to cover the 20% difference in the books. So sticker price for two masters at that time was about 56 grand together combined. Well, I don't have that kind of money just around. And so I looked at that, and then I looked at the salary and went, uh-oh, I don't know if we can swing this, because the salary was low. Well, but they gave these epic perks. So my wife and I talked about it. We said, all right, let's give it a go. We had enough in savings that we could cover that 20% gap. And then my wife was working for part of that before a little guy was born. And so we saved and saved and saved, and then got on a payment plan. So I'm piecing together a bunch of different parts here. And then we said yes. And then I started in March of 2013. And we started grad school in the August of 2013. So 5 months, we busted really hard to save as much as we can. But problem, the money was draining faster than we felt comfortable with. And it was an 18-month program. And we were looking at the savings going, I don't know if there's enough to cover the 18-month span. So, because I didn't have anything else to do besides work full-time and go to school full-time and have an infant, I got a part-time job on the weekends. another one of those really thick seasons. But I looked ahead and went, if I don't do this, we're going to hit a brick wall. And so we were looking at trajectory and context and going, can we handle that? Yeah, I'm going to sleep less, but in the words of Arnold Schwarzenegger, too bad, sleep faster. And so we said yes. And so for 18 months, we lived this pretty intense cycle. And then towards the end of that, in 2015, at the end of the degree, is when I started at Birch just over 7 years ago. So we looked ahead and saw this epic opportunity. And though we were going to take a hit on the savings and then on sleep, we saw the bigger trajectory and thought this was a good stewardship moment to position us as a couple and a family. And then now in my case, to do what I get to do with you all, of creating value. Crowdfunding, I'm just saying it's an option. Not people like this approach, but it does work. It can help, especially if you got a compelling story. Volunteer organizations. So you volunteer for a year or a significant amount of time, and then that organization will then commit to a certain amount of scholarship. So a couple, AmeriCorps has a pretty robust one. Teach for America, Boys and Girl Scouts, and 4-H. All four of those organizations have resources to give to people who commit to them for a period of time. Military, of course, not everyone's favorite, but it does fund a lot. There's a lot of resources there. And you could start this even in ROTC, which is the Reserve Officer Training Corps. That starts in high school and even goes into college too. If you do military after college, you can do ROTC to commit to the military, and they'll help fund in the meantime, and then you commit on the back end. I mentioned this already, PEO International, single moms. And then another little free bonus here, and then we'll wrap up in just a few minutes. If you've got extended family that are just itching to give you money to help pay for your kids' college, tell them to hold their dough, wait, save it, until after the family's been awarded. And you can have grandparent, aunt, uncle, or your second cousin twice removed, and just have them cut a check directly to the school. And this is legit. This is totally fine. They just send a check to the school. This is to help pay for Sally, Joe. And it bypasses all of your financial aid package. It's a nice little trick. Totally legal, by the way. Just a couple resources for you. Books. I don't really recommend books on this topic. Partly because they get outdated real quick. And I've read some of them and I've researched some of them, and the reviews are kind of meh. So you could just Google, like, what are the top 5 books on how to pay for college without debt, and you're going to get maybe a couple good things out of it. But there's too many, and it's just kind of a weaker space because there's too much change that happens in this space. But websites, you've seen this one pop up several times, collegeboard.org. This should be one of your best friends in the online space for college planning purposes. Same with finaid.org. They got all kinds of good resources and avenues, things to consider. And then lastly, the College Investor. This dude's been around for quite a while. It's a blog, and his whole world is just helping families pay for stuff. Now he does get into like affiliate marketing stuff. And he's definitely not shy of loans, but there are some other good resources there. So, things to think about as we wrap up. For your own sake, are you willing to commit to a debt-free approach? You don't have to answer this. This is just rhetorical questions to muse on. given what we've walked through, and yes, it's a lot of work. Yes, it's different from what your kids' peers are going to be doing. And I know there's concern there. Well, what if they graduate at 24 instead of 22? What does it do for peer? I get that. But when I graduated undergrad at 33, instead of playing Frisbee on the lawn, I was playing soccer on Friday afternoons with a bunch of 20-year-olds. It was quite humbling, but it worked. Another question to muse on is how hard and how long are you willing to work to do this? Because it's not just for the time itself. It's the implications, the ramifications for decades. And consider you as a student, if you take this approach and then you hook up with somebody, what I mean by that is that you meet someone and you want to spend the rest of your life together. What happens if they come to the table with a lot of student debt? I'm not saying don't marry someone because they have debt, but think about the ramifications of choice. And lastly, is it possible to get a degree without debt? I had this same poll at the very beginning on Tuesday night, so I'm asking it again a couple days later after we've talked. So what do you think? Thanks for the honesty. I like that. Just a couple more people and then we'll be done. Again, it's anonymous, so I can't see who's answering what. Awesome. Thanks for that. So I will share this. So the vast majority of you think yes. A couple of you still aren't convinced. That's totally fine. So that's it. At least that's what I have. So if you ever want to have a more personalized dialogue about, okay, I heard all that, but here's our unique situation, please feel free to reach out to Tina and I. This topic is near and dear to my heart. I love having these conversations with families to get strategic, but I do think it's absolutely possible to try and position yourselves in or your students to learn to create epic value without being financially burdened. So thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. You'll get the links tomorrow for these last two if you want to go back and reference it later. They're private YouTube links. We're only giving it to those who've been here tonight, completing the both nights. And as always, I'll linger for a few minutes if you've got any questions you want to talk about. Otherwise, thank you for being with us tonight. Have a wonderful, blessed rest of your week, and we'll see you around.